Please enter the containment chamber.
Ah, I wasn't aware we had company. We rarely get visitors down here.
So, you really don't want to leave this place alive, do you? You know there's no way a lone D-class like you will make it to the surface safely.
Subject D9341 designated for termination. Fire at will. Please approach SCP-173 for testing. There seems to be a problem with the door control system. The door isn't responding to any of our attempts to close it.
Foundation operates on three basic principles: secure, contain, and protect.
Disclaimer. The following video will contain gruesome and dark content, jump scares, flashing lights, sensitive topics involving bodily harm, and stories that feature violence. Viewer discretion is advised. SCP, Secure, Contain, Protect. This name is known online as a fictional world across the internet. SCP is a facility known to house and contain some of the most disturbing, grotesque, and abominable creatures that are known as a threat to all of humanity, at least the most popular ones. These creatures would be collected into a singular location where researchers, doctors, and scientists would keep track of them, studying their movements, how they were born or created, their potential weaknesses, and if they pose a threat to human beings or animals. They are referred to as an SCP, but with a number accompanying it. The purpose of this facility is to capture, kill, or keep the SCPs for collecting data, but it is also with the intention to prevent mass panic across the Earth and protecting society, so it may continue to function as usual. However, if there is failure in containing these wonders, they potentially could bring upon events that are catastrophic, putting multiple humans in danger, or even lead to ending a world by these freaks of nature. The SCPs are contained all by one foundation, and there are documents shown across websites that are used for gaining knowledge, or knowing what these creatures are capable of. Most are able to be identifiable easily, but some are kept as classified. The facility itself is known to be a dangerous, suspicious, unsafe, violent, and cruel atmosphere in terms of what resides within it, and we are unsure if these aforementioned workers for the facility are doing so for a good cause, or for something entirely different. This franchise, so to speak, can be seen as a creepypasta, but with a massive universe that includes beautifully written storytelling and highly detailed descriptions for the monsters, as well as what the representatives at the facility go through. Now, in my personal opinion, I don't have a hate for creepypastas. Some I personally like to read, but they tend to make me laugh or cringe more than be scared, due to the childish writing that sometimes the authors give out. No offense to them, but they don't really do it for me in terms of scare. But for others that read them, I can definitely see the appeal. But SCP is a special case in this regard. Some may find it quite intimidating, or they are really intrigued in the rabbit hole this universe has to offer. It's definitely been a trending topic for content creators within the YouTube platform. Videos are created based on specific creatures, stories, and origins, and some are even animated or audio recorded in a clever manner. However, there is one creature, one that specifically catches the eye of many, no pun intended, one that is oddly colored, cold, deadly, and easily recognizable by many, to the point to where it is seen as the mascot of the series. What a cutie pie, isn't he?
Chiseled, sexy peanut butter complexion.
Greetings to you all. Today, we shall be covering a series that is known by many to be famous within the gaming and fictional internet storytelling community.
SCP has been something I had invested time into for years, including the video games, and more so the story. But, despite my large time investment, it is rather difficult to pinpoint what times and what exactly occurred within this foundation, and this is due to most of the franchise revealing story in a lore-based format. However, what I can reveal to you is a lot of what these creatures are capable of, and I will be going into the origins of them, as well as how the SCP franchise was created. Many may ask what this facility is hiding from us. What are its dirtiest secrets? Who or what is responsible for this being created? Or, I guess, what the hell even is an SCP? And well, my dear viewers, for some of those potential questions you could have, I believe you came to the right place. Because we will be going into heavy detail on what this rabbit hole is really about. And with that being said, thank you all for stopping in. Make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and I hope you all enjoy this video. Because I know I will. Let us begin. And before I sink my knees deep into this, let me help put you into some context to help newcomers understand what they are getting themselves into. Remember how I mentioned creepypastas, right? Well, for some of you out there that are not aware, a creepypasta is an online written story about horror-related wonders that are shared throughout the internet. These entrees are usually biographies or paranormal stories that were intended to scare readers. They are also prominent in including gruesome descriptions of gore, mutilation, and otherworldly occurrences. The subject matter of creepypastas can vary widely. They usually include topics like ghosts, serial killers, zombies, and let's not forget to mention the haunted video game stories as well as television shows. Examples such as Ben Drowned, the haunted version of Majora's Mask involving a handsome Link statue. Evil Otto from a potentially made-up game called Berserk, which involved a player dying with a smile. The Luna game, which was that weird My Little Pony horror game that had jump scares, as well as flashing images. And then you got Sonic.exe, which I find to be complete dog shit, was about a haunted game involving a heavily modified PC port of Sonic, showing imagery with what I quote,
hyper-realistic blood.
But aside all that mess, we have ones like Slenderman, who is potentially the most widely known creepypasta creature out there, as well as other creatures that are popular, like Jeff the Killer and so on. And what's interesting enough is that some of these stories actually have video games tied to them. A perfect example is a game titled Slender, The 8 Pages. It's a free game made in June 2012, and the game is based on the folklore of Slenderman, who is basically a tall humanoid creature sporting a black suit and tie with a white face and no facial features. The character is known for the ominous, although fictional, abduction of countless children in dark, mysterious settings, such as a deep forest or abandoned buildings. The game's objective appears to be simple, but you would be surprised. The goal is to collect all 8 pages scattered around a dark forest while avoiding the Slenderman. However, after each page you collect, the music becomes more intense, the forest grows darker, and you begin to move slower. And even if you manage to collect all 8, the Slenderman still kills you, regardless of your achievement. What a classic. Now I could stay here all day and speak about dozens of stories for creepypastas, but the point I'm trying to make here is that the origins of SCP relate to that of creepypastas and how they were created. Stories of monsters, devious creatures, and background lore are related to that of SCP, and what the true core of it is. However, SCP was perhaps one of the grandfathers that popularized this genre of internet writing. That is, if we aren't including the 2001 Angelfire Frightening Cave System story, or back in the 1990s when creepypastas emerged from chain emails that got reposted on internet forums and Usenet groups. Therefore, I say it's awful difficult to make a history of the genre due to this reason. Now that we got all that out of the way, let us take a look into SCP's origins and roots, shall we? In the beginning, the roots of SCP and some stories are able to be traced back to 2007. They were found on the X-board of 4chan, which at the time, the board had a great reputation, being a part of the site that held a lot of similar threads that would scare people. During this point in time, creepypastas were a new and inventive concept for many writers to create and post their own tales. However, there was one post that was not heard of, one that managed to set a spark off within the horror genre. On June 22nd, 2007, there was a post that was created on the X-board, which was a creepypasta. The interesting part was that the title had not mentioned the name SCP, but instead, something different. The name was from the files of Site-19. This creepypasta was a story that was written in detail about an item named SCP-173. They describe that it is to be kept into a locked container at all times, and when personnel must enter SCP-173's container, no fewer than 3 may enter at any time, and the door is to be relocked behind them. At all times, 2 persons must be looking at SCP-173 until all personnel have vacated and relocked the container. It further elaborates on its description and location, stating that it is constructed from concrete and rebar, and was once painted with Krylon brand spray paint. It also goes into further detail on how dangerous this creature is, stating that SCP-173 is animate and malevolent, and if given the chance, it will kill anyone within its line of sight. Its weakness, however, is that it does not move while being watched. Despite its paralysis, it is still highly dangerous, meaning that it is able to cover at least 2 meters in the literal blink of an eye. This post then continues on about how it attacks its victims, by either strangulation or breaking the victim's neck from behind them. The statue itself is said to have an unbreakable grip, and when it's not moving, the statue is as hard and strong as concrete. When the statue is left alone in its room, one can hear stone on stone scraping within it, and it's assumed to be the sound of SCP-173 moving about. There is also a reddish-brown substance on the floor, which is a combination of feces and blood. We don't know, nor wish to find out where it comes from, or how it arrives, but SCP-173's container will slowly fill with these substances. In order to ensure that bacterial growth within does not begin to damage the building it is contained in, and to maintain some level of sanitation, the enclosure must be cleaned on a bi-weekly basis. This older thread that was made can still be viewed in archiving websites, as well as other various online sources. The thread made an effect on people when it was posted, scaring them, as well as creating ideas to more tales that were similar to this post. Some have stated that this creature is a reference to the 3rd season episode of Doctor Who. The episode was named Blink, which showed the main characters trying to escape statues that remain still when you look at them, but when you don't, they attack. Lots of anonymous users have criticized the grammar, as well as some of the spelling for this post. However, this post was also seen as something unique. The post was written in a form of a lab report, done by some scientist. There wasn't even a narration, no introduction, climax, or an ending. It's simply just a post that reported a monstrous being that is capable of ending one's life within split seconds, or as some say, in the blink of an eye. With this post being in mind, it opens a huge universe to the potential factor of several creatures such as SCP-173 existing. Therefore, some within this export had commented on wanting to make this post into an actual huge story to make the internet bricks. Ever since this occurred, the Anon users would band together and work on new stories, as well as reposting SCP-173. This in turn would bring about more creatures. However, at this time, they were but a very small handful. Later on, around January of 2008, SCP had started to become a trend once more, which then led to multiple creations of other threads over this up-and-coming universe. Within these threads, more of these posts were spawned onto the internet between January 17th and 19th. These tales would begin a new franchise, and more creatures were eventually placed into this universe, which then led to the new franchise known as the SCP series. Before I continue on to the history, I perhaps have forgotten to mention something important. Let's just call them classifications, or simply a danger level. Now, I am unsure as to when this alignment system for the SCPs were originally made. I'm assuming somewhere around 2008. But I shall introduce it to you now before we proceed, to identify the precautions, or shall I say expectancy, of what the SCPs are capable of in terms of behavior. They each have classes suited to them to determine if they are harmless or very much dangerous. As far as I know, there are 5 of these classes that are labeled onto the SCPs. We shall be covering each of them, as well as some examples. First class, safe, and is also the easiest to contain. Safe class SCPs are anomalies that are easily and safely contained. This is often due to the fact that the Foundation has researched the SCP well enough that containment does not require significant resources, or that the anomalies require specific and conscious activation or trigger. Normally, the SCPs that are labeled this are to not be stupendously cautious of. At least, not yet, depending on which ones. Classifying an SCP as safe, however, does not mean that handling or activating it does not pose a threat. Some could set off and become deadly if dealt with improperly, but if all procedures are followed accordingly, there is nothing to worry about with said SCP whatsoever. I mean, hell, some could even be considered pets. An example is SCP-131. Object class, safe. According to the procedures, there are no special safety precautions to be taken with these two. They travel about Site-19, as long as they don't attempt to enter any restricted areas, or attempt to leave the facility. Casual contact with the subjects is permitted, but it is recommended that such contact be kept to a minimum, to prevent the creatures from forming an attachment to personnel. Hourly tabs are to be kept on subjects at all times. Failure to account for their presence at these times constitutes a Level 1 lockdown situation. Any report of abuse or mistreatment of the subjects will result in a harsh reprimand. As described, these creatures are nicknamed Ipods. They are teardrop-shaped creatures that are 1 foot tall, with a single blue eye in the middle of their bodies. One is identified as SCP-131-A, and the other is SCP-131-B. A being the orange boy, and B being the yellow boy. They also seem to have a wheel for movement, and are biomechanical in origin. The subjects can also move surprisingly fast, covering over 200 feet within seconds. But these two fellas lack a braking system, which leads to amusing mishaps involving them. The subjects are also capable of climbing sheer surfaces, but would also get lost in air vents at times. They also apparently have the intelligence of house cats, and are very curious like one as well. They are known to be very affectionate, easily bonding to anyone that gives it such attention. They too can also sense danger in their general vicinity, as well as even warning a companion of the more dangerous SCPs. Now, what I find to be interesting about these creatures is not only are they very cute, but they are also known to not blink. They also have been seen doing as such, but an incident that occurred within the SCP universe has proven that these little guys have a purpose in terms of help. According to the files, there was an incident that took place in the facility, which involved them following one of the cleaning staff on routine cleaning of the container of SCP-173. They tried attempting to warn the cleaner of the danger that was present, but they were ignored. The creatures rushed into the container in front of him and the other 2 personnel on duty. Once inside, the staff members observed the subject sitting in front of SCP-173, watching it intently, as if they are aware that it could only move if unobserved. Since this was the case, it is simply shown that some SCPs are not all bad, and if anything, they could either become something cute and friendly, perhaps a life-saving creature, perhaps a tool to help fix something, or a weakness to a foul beast. Anyways, let us continue into our next class, for this one shall pique some interest, and some would say it's definitely a mysterious one. Second class, Euclid. Predictable. Euclid class SCPs are anomalies that require more resources to contain completely, or where containment isn't always reliable. Usually, this is because the SCP is insufficiently understood, sentient, and/or inherently unpredictable. Euclid is the object class with the greatest scope, and it's usually a safe bet that an SCP will be this class, if it doesn't easily fall into any of the other standard object classes, which can also imply that some Euclid class SCPs could be dangerous, or capable of inflicting harm to others, whether it's malicious or mistreated. SCPs that fall under this category are to follow procedures much more carefully, or else it could lead to some potentially disastrous results. It is also known that many SCPs are labeled as Euclid due to their mysterious nature. An example of a Euclid class SCP would have to be SCP-173, whom we already mentioned earlier and described all the details of, but I will provide a different one instead. SCP-049, Object Class, Euclid. The special containment procedures show that SCP-049 is contained within a standard secure humanoid containment cell in Research Sector 2 at Site 19. SCP-049 must be sedated before any attempts to transport it. During transport, SCP-049 must be secured with a Class 3 humanoid restriction harness, including a locking collar and extension restraints, and monitored by no fewer than 2 armed guards. While SCP-049 is generally cooperative with most Foundation personnel, outbursts or sudden changes in behavior are to be met with elevated force. Under no circumstances should any personnel come into direct contact with SCP-049 during these outbursts. In the event SCP-049 becomes aggressive, the application of lavender has been shown to produce a calming effect on the entity. Once calmed, SCP-049 generally becomes compliant, and will return to containment with little resistance. In order to facilitate the ongoing containment of SCP-049, the entity is to be provided with the corpse of a recently deceased animal, typically a bovine, or other large mammals, once every 2 weeks for study. Corpses that become instances of SCP-049-2 are to be removed from SCP-049's containment cell and incinerated. SCP-049 is no longer permitted to interact with human subjects, and requests for human subjects are to be denied. SCP-049 is a humanoid entity, roughly 1.9 meters in height, which bears the appearance of a medieval plague doctor. While SCP-049 appears to be wearing the thick robes and the ceramic mask indicative of that profession, the garments seem to have grown out of SCP-049's body over time, and are now nearly indistinguishable from whatever form was beneath them. X-rays indicate that despite this, SCP-049 does have a humanoid skeletal structure beneath its outer layer. SCP-049 is capable of speech in a variety of languages, though tends to prefer English or medieval French. While SCP-049 is generally cordial and cooperative with Foundation staff, it can become especially irritated, or at times outright aggressive, if it feels that it is in the presence of what it calls the pestilence. Although the exact nature of this pestilence is currently unknown to Foundation researchers, it does seem to be an issue of immense concern to SCP-049. SCP-049 will become hostile with individuals it sees as being affected by the pestilence, often having to be restrained should it encounter such a thing. If left unchecked, SCP-049 will generally attempt to kill any such individual. SCP-049 is capable of causing all biological functions of an organism to cease through direct skin contact. How this occurs is currently unknown, and autopsies of SCP-049's victims have invariably been inconclusive. SCP-049 has expressed frustration or remorse after these killings, indicating that they have done little to kill the pestilence, though will usually seek to then perform a crude surgery on the corpse, using the implements contained within a black doctor's bag it carries on its person at all times. While these surgeries are not always successful, they often result in the creation of instances of SCP-049-2. SCP-049-2 instances are reanimated corpses that have been operated on by SCP-049. These instances do not seem to retain any of their prior memories or mental functions, having only basic motor skills and response mechanisms. While these instances are generally inactive, moving very little, and in a generally ambulatory fashion, they can become extremely aggressive if provoked, or if directed to by SCP-049. SCP-0492 instances express active biological functions, though these are vastly different from currently understood human physiology. Despite these alterations, SCP-049 often remarks that the subjects have been quote-unquote cured. SCP-049 was discovered during the investigation of a series of unknown disappearances in the town of Montauban in southern France. During a raid on a local home, investigators found several instances of SCP-0492, as well as SCP-049. While law enforcement personnel engaged the hostile 0492 instances, SCP-049 was noted as watching the engagement and taking notes in its journal. After all of the 0492 instances were dispatched, SCP-049 willingly entered the Foundation custody. Now, before I get a little carried away, I could go on and on about the Doctor, with his interviews and logs, but for now he is just an example of what a Euclid is capable of. But if you do want to see more of his story, I recommend the SCP Foundation wiki. Euclids in general can be quite terrifying, or even in some cases, worse than the next class I'm going to be getting into. Euclid is an unpredictable, unknowing, and also a ladder of danger when it comes down to it, and most SCPs are placed under this class, as mentioned before. However, the next class we are going to be describing is actually much worse than Euclid, to the point to where it could lead to world-ending results, or universes being destroyed. Let us move on to the third class for the SCP subjects. Third class, Keter. Hardest to contain. The designation Keter is assigned to subjects that both A. display vigorous, active hostility to human life, civilization, and/or space-time, and B. are capable of causing significant destruction in the event of a containment breach. Such subjects must be cataloged, contained according to special containment procedures, and destroyed if possible. Merely being inimical to human life is not in itself cause for classification as a Keter-level object. A Keter classification indicates that not only is a subject capable of inflicting devastating harm to human life and civilization, but that containment protocols must be extensive, involved, and precisely followed in order to prevent it from doing so. Research into the neutralization of Keter-class SCPs is always a top priority for the Foundation. Cases where Keter-class objects that can be neutralized by Foundation personnel persist in Foundation custody are rare, and are grouped into three main categories. In addition to cases where destruction of the object continues to be unfeasible due to apparent invulnerability or similar circumstance, there are some Keter-class objects with significant tactical value for the Foundation, as well as Keter-class objects that threaten more harm to humanity from their neutralization than that from their continued existence. The example I will provide is also one of the SCPs that has originated after SCP-173, in terms of when the creatures were known publicly, one that is dangerous and is actually resembling something straight out of a horror novel. SCP-682, Object Class, Keter. The procedures state that SCP-682 must be destroyed as soon as possible. At this time, no means available to SCP teams are capable of destroying SCP-682, only able to cause massive physical damage. SCP-682 should be contained within a 5 meter by 5 meter by 5 meter chamber, with 25 centimeter reinforced acid-resistant steel plate lining all inside surfaces. The containment chamber should be filled with hydrochloric acid until SCP-682 is submerged and incapacitated. Any attempts of SCP-682 to move, speak, or breach containment should be reacted to quickly and with full force as called for by the circumstances. Personnel are forbidden to speak to SCP-682 for fear of provoking a rage state. All unauthorized personnel attempting to communicate with SCP-682 will be restrained and removed by force. Due to its frequent attempts at containment breach, difficulty of containment and incapacitation, and high threat of Foundation exposure, SCP-682 is to be contained in sight. The Foundation will use the best of its resources to maintain all land within 50 kilometers clear of human development. Description: SCP-682 is a large, vaguely reptile-like creature of unknown origin. It appears to be extremely intelligent, and was observed to engage in complex communications with SCP-079 during their limited time of exposure. SCP-682 appears to have a hatred of all life, which has been expressed in several interviews during containment. SCP-682 has always been observed to have extremely high strength, speed, and reflexes, though exact levels vary with its form. SCP-682's physical body grows and changes very quickly, growing or decreasing in size as it consumes or sheds material. SCP-682 gains energy from anything it ingests, organic or inorganic. Digestion seems to be aided by a set of filtering gills inside of SCP-682's nostrils, which are able to remove usable matter from any liquid solution, enabling it to constantly regenerate from the acid it is contained in. SCP-682's regenerative capabilities and resilience are staggering, and SCP-682 has been seen moving and speaking with its body 87% destroyed or rotted. In case of containment breach, SCP-682 is to be tracked and recaptured by all available mobile task forces, and no teams with fewer than 7 members are cleared to engage it. To date, attempted breaches have numbered at 17. While successful breaches have numbered at 6. SCP-682 is but one of many whom are capable of so much destruction and is so difficult to capture, let alone destroying it. Keter is a class on what you get when an SCP has the intentions, or shall I say capabilities, of destroying all of humankind. There are actually some SCPs out there that are surprisingly worse than 682. However, we shall get into some more later on in the video. But for now, let us move on to the next class. Fourth class, Thamuel. Thamuel class SCPs are anomalies that the Foundation uses to contain or counteract other SCPs or anomalous phenomena. Even the mere existence of Thamuel class objects is classified at the highest levels of the Foundation, and their locations, functions, and current status are known to few Foundation personnel outside of the O5 Council. In short, think of it as an SCP that is capable of nullifying or helps securing other SCPs. These SCPs are very unique in this aspect and are seen as tools or something to make usage of. However, they obviously can also be a threat. And since this class is so unique, not too many are come across in the SCP universe. However, when they are, they prove to be very intriguing, especially in the next example I will be providing. SCP-179, Object Class, from Safe to Thamuel. Special containment procedures show that SCP-179 remains beyond the reach of currently known groups of interest, including the Foundation. All containment efforts are to be focused towards a Grade 3 omission cover-up, coupled with the discouragement or sabotage of exploration and research missions that attempt to study Cis Mercury in space and orbits that go through it. SCP-179 is described as a humanoid entity located at a constant distance of approximately 40,000 kilometers from the south polar region of the solar photosphere, locked to the rotation axis of Sol. However, it does not orbit it. The most recent recordings of SCP-179 indicate that it seems to maintain a continuous orbit around the center of the galaxy, through the combined efforts of 43 years of continuous surveying. The external appearance of SCP-179 has been defined as a human female of undetermined ethnic group, of between 20 and 40 years of age. Its entire bodily surface is covered in and or composed of matte black material. Its hair appears to be composed of this material, measuring over 34 kilometers long, and is constantly pushed away by solar wind. However, this part of SCP-179 seems to reflect variable amounts of sunlight, this reflection being the phenomenon that indicated its existence to Foundation astrophysicists during 1940. Several markings or tattoos are placed throughout its body midline. Judging from their brightness, these markings might be of metallic composition and of golden hue. These tattoos include several symbols that have been identified as those typically representing the Sun and the 6 innermost planets of the solar system, according to medieval alchemy, including, in this order, the symbol of gold in the subject's forehead, right underneath the hairline, the symbol of Mercury under the nose, circling both lips, the symbol of copper between the medial ends of its clavicles. It also has an atomically correct shape of a human heart, placed over the location where a heart would be in a female human of the same apparent age and bodily proportions, the symbol of iron in the upper abdominal region, the symbol of tin in the lower abdominal region, and part of a final symbol in the pelvic region. While the anatomy of this region makes its clear observation difficult, it has been hypothesized that the symbol of lead is also present and complete in the perineum region. SCP-179 keeps its ventral side orientated towards Earth most of the time, but it has been observed to look towards other areas on occasion. SCP-179's existence will be subjected to an orbital misinformation, standardized intelligence obstruction, and neutralization campaign. That's a mouthful. As per Omission Protocol 4, most documentation related to SCP-179 has been classified Level 4, which is top secret. Any further data related to SCP-179 has been classified Level 5, Thamuel, and will be made available only to authorized 5 and 179 personnel. This seems pretty confusing as hell, huh? But just you wait. We are but just scratching the surface of what's to come in terms of what the facility is all about. Thamuel in general is a rough one to rank for most of the SCPs, but when the time comes for an out-of-control SCP that needs nullification, or I guess capturing, Thamuels are the best ones that will be used for these phenomenons. However, the next class that we are going to be mentioning is seen as one of the most deadly, or shall I say so dangerous that it is even more threatening than Keter class at times. And it's also very mysterious and kinda cryptic if you ask me. Let us continue, shall we? 5th class, Apollyon. This class is used for SCPs that are impossible to contain, or are about to irrevocably break containment. An SCP with this class will inevitably end the world. This classification was first used on SCP-927 on the Edit This Wiki in 2008, and it essentially meant that the SCP was a particularly dangerous Keter. The original iteration of the Apollyon class did not appear in any additional SCPs, and was ultimately removed from SCP-927 by September of 2008. This class did not appear again until 2014, when it was used on SCP-2317. Dr. Clef, who is the author of 2317, did not intend for Apollyon to be a serious object class. Rather, the class was meant to indicate that the SCP article was abnormal, and that the documentation was something hidden, even from most of the SCP Foundation. But anyways, as stated, think of it as a Keter, but about 5 times worse, as well as the potential capability of ending all life as we know it. However, Keter can also at times prove more lethal and dangerous than Apollyon, since Keter is such a broad term for classifications in my opinion. However, some may argue that the SCP I'm going to represent for this class isn't an Apollyon. But, with its world-ending capabilities, I am fairly sure it's safe to say so. And the SCP that I'm going to represent is going to be SCP-001. Anyways, in short, Apollyon you could say is a pretty lethal class, and overall is considered one of, if not the most dangerous. Now for my research, several other classes are referenced, or even stated, such as Archon, Maxor, as well as Neutralized, but I'm pretty sure some of you already know what that already means by now. But I felt it was more important to address the 5 main classes. Anywho, now that you should be fully aware as to what the classes represent, let us get back on track from where we last left off. During 2008, when a lot of the SCP threads were taking off on 4chan, lots of users would complain about it, to the point to where on January 19th, 2008, when one man actually created a whole ass wiki dedicated to SCP, or was simply called the SCP Wiki. During this time it was created, it was using a wiki farm called Edit This, which many consider exactly like Wikipedia. When this was created, several of the threads and story writers who invented all of their creatures would move to this website, including the original ones that were made on the X-board. Thankfully, this website was able to hold all of these stories together to make it its own universe, rather than just being an anonymous user posting threads. The writers then had an opportunity to create their tales and post them to the SCP Wiki, which then led to their stories being set as foundations for this universe. These writers are named Dr. Gears, Fritz Willy, and Kane Pathos Crow. Going back just a tad, SCP-682 was one of the original SCPs that were created, as mentioned, and this creature was brought to life from a large amount of the other new SCPs that were posted to 4chan. The origins of this lad was from an English GCSC paper. However, it was seen as mediocre. It was also missing the interview log at this time, while many of the other SCPs had that treatment. Even the description was lacking in quality. But thankfully there was a writer who was on the Edit This wiki to make the story into something more intriguing than how it originally was. However, at the time, Edit This wiki had a severe bug problem, as well as it being very difficult to find other writers within that group. Some writers who were even influential would even experience this similar issue, such as one named Ebderstrom, who is sadly forgotten about, or even remained silent. Half a year later, the post numbers would increase a lot, from hundreds to less than tens, but an interesting subject would eventually come up. More so as a notice. The previously mentioned, or shall I say infamous, SCP-001. The supposed first SCP was actually not supposed to exist. This SCP is one of the biggest mysteries within the SCP universe, and several writers would try to submit proposals. However, it still remains hidden in the dark as to what it could be. But there are a lot of notes that lead up to what it most likely is, and I believe with some of my research that I perhaps have a proposal. From my understanding, despite all the threats that the SCP universe has, there seems to be one that is an overarching antagonist that many writers have gone into, but unfortunately there is lack of canon within the SCP universe. However, there could also be a theory that this SCP has managed to live within all these origins at once. But anyways, let's get into some pretty hefty details. This SCP, that many consider to be SCP-001, is known as the Scarlet King, the one and only that many consider to be the big bad of SCP. He is an old god that is nearly omnipotent, which seeks to spread destruction to all, erase existence itself, and has committed every single crime known to mankind. And yes, even that one. From what is also heard is that he appears within the universe, but as an unseen antagonist, as well as one of the many SCPs that is proposed to be suited for number 1. They say he is also ancient, and is often tied to the end of existence itself. I will tell some of the origins on how he must have came about, however this seems to be more of a headcanon bit rather than legitimate. except for one that I will definitely get into. Let us continue. The first was named Dust and Blood. It is stated that the Scarlet King was one of the many gods born with the planting of the Tree of Knowledge, called Karak at the time. He was the smallest of his siblings, but the only one aware, and it brought him great pain. He decided that existence itself is painful, and that he'd have no part in it. As well as destroying existence itself, he started consuming his siblings and growing stronger on their essence. And he vowed to destroy the tree, the creator and creation, and consumed or subjugated all the other gods, naming himself King of the Darkness Below. He declared war on creation itself, one which will not end until the very end of everything. He took Sana, one of the gods he subjugated, forcibly as his wife, and sired 7 daughters onto her. Sana died after birthing them, and the king took his 7 daughters as his new brides, sealing them so they would not die as their mother had. From his 7 bride daughters, he had 7 children called Leviathans. Other gods and older beings agreed to follow him as well. Among them were Jesser, Goran, Moloch, and the Hanged King. There is also another origin named Some Are Born to Endless Night, where it describes that the Scarlet King was originally created, as well as other anomalies, through the dreams of Jacob Montauk, alongside other SCP-3553-A instances. Jacob was one of the many SCP-3553-A instances. Children who were mysteriously transported to a dark dream dimension through an SCP-3553-B incident. They could use their imagination to affect the world they were in, as well as reality on Earth, but they would cease to exist if they stopped imagining, or stopped exchanging their memories with each other. Eventually, as the children began fading away, Jacob used his imagination to merge with the remaining children, and their combined imagination brought back those faded children, and had absorbed them into their mass. After all of the children were fused together, they began dreaming of higher concepts such as deities, eventually creating in 19th March of 3994 the concept of the 7 brides and the Scarlet King, who represented their determination, suffering, and hopelessness. Now, there is one more story that I found very intriguing. However, as a quick warning, it contains sensitive subject matter. This tale actually has somewhat of a canon, and it can actually tie into some of the previous stories that I just told. In relation to the Scarlet King, there is SCP-2317, Object Class, Keter. Sometime in the modern world, the children of the Scarlet King kidnapped several young women and performed a ritual on them that involved horrible torture, in order to turn them into effigies of the Scarlet King's brides, causing the girls to become pregnant with the King's abominations. Information in regards to this group is that the children of the Scarlet King are a recurring antagonist in the SCP universe. They are a thaumaturgical cult that worships the Scarlet King, and the children of the Scarlet King started out as an imperial cult in the Davite Empire, which served and worshipped the Scarlet King in the ancient times. Following the destruction of their empire, the cult was able to survive in the modern age, and eventually, as part of their plan to bring their god to their reality, it involved the kidnapping of 7 women. Unfortunately, whenever one of these women gives birth, they will spawn an SCP, or a catastrophic event will occur, or both. These 7 women were discovered after police searched a warehouse that was also held by the organization. 24 hours of them being rescued, the first female, who was 2311, was going through labor and gave birth to an SCP. Unfortunately, this caused more than 100 casualties, and the woman was deceased during the initial recovery operation. The Foundation immediately would take ownership of SCPs 2312 to 7. There has also been notebooks recovered from the cult, and they would institute Procedure 110 Montauk to prevent the birth of their children, as well as preventing future calamities. All personnel that are assigned to SCP-2317 are required to rotate one another for 1 month of psychological counseling after 2 months of being on site. They will also be transported to SCP-231's containment area blindfolded from Site-19, whether by aircraft, mobile, etc. If they remove the blindfold during the transportation process, they will immediately be terminated. From what the Foundation has stated, if there is an attempt to remove the child from the mother, or if the mother passes away, it will result in a problematic event. Unfortunately, 6 of them are deceased. SCP-2312 has been neutralized due to attempting removal of the SCP baby, which unfortunately caused another incident. SCP-2313 has taken their own life, which happened due to the distress of the 110 Montauk, and afterwards led to more casualties. 2314 attempted to administer SCP-500, which claims to cure the subject of all diseases. It did manage to remove all parts of the produced SCP baby, but the residue unfortunately would lead to another event, causing numerous casualties, including SCP-2314 herself. SCP-2315 had an improper execution of the 110 Montauk procedure, which led to the birth of an SCP 1 hour later, and in turn caused another incident. And 2316 had died due to an attempt at escaping, which was also due to the assistance of an agent. The agent was exhibiting high levels of stress due to the prolonged exposure of SCP-231, which led to the agent holding a weapon in an attempt to rescue 2316 and 7. However, the agent and 6 are taken out in resulting gunfire. And of course, the fetus from 6 has caused another unfortunate event. All that now remains is 7, and she's been successfully contained. However, it is believed that if she was to give birth, it could lead to an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, which is similar as to what the Scarlet King intends to do. Now, in my opinion, as well as several others that may say otherwise, I believe Scarlet King deserves the spot of 001. Not to mention it's rooted itself pretty deep within the universe of SCP. Anyways, back to the subject of the SCP Wiki history. During the days and times of Edit This, viewers would start seeing a lot more stories from the SCP universe, and they would be growing a lot in popularity. There is also one SCP by the name of Josie the Half Cat, and the story was popular in the SCP franchise, to the point to where it resulted in her being the first logo of SCP. Back then, before SCP became a lot more organized, the wiki was experiencing a major issue at the time, and it was in fact that it lacked little to no quality control or guidelines, which in turn gave too much freedom to write whatever sort of creature they wanted, no matter how ridiculous it was. The only sort of help that was offered was a link, located at the very bottom, basically titled How to Write an SCP. This was also optional and not required, which meant that writers could just post garbage-ass stories, or even vague texts, and still manage to get their SCP creature on the wiki. And the entrees were just so bad that they could almost be mistaken for Wattpad articles. Unfortunately, this led to them actually keeping these stories, since there's really no way to delete it without some sort of dispute, which even included the typos and errors and everything, and sadly those would just stay onto the site forever. During this time, SCP would eventually take shape in a scientific nature, and as it would continue, more add-ons would be made, and it led to people creating more creatures, but it was lacking less and less science involved with them, which is unfortunate since this franchise is meant to be science fiction horror, and it would disregard what the SCP Foundation originally goes for. Even though the universe is all about fiction, it needed realism involved to make the story a lot more impactful, as well as creepy. That way the immersion for these stories would be provided a lot better for viewers. Since this was the case, it led to a post from a user named Aiden in which he addressed some of these issues.
Would anyone really object to me going through these over the course of the next week or two and truncating the overly precise measurements? There are quite a few SCPs that say stuff like approximately 57.2354545 blah 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 centimeters. There's no need to go down to nanometers when you're writing an executive summary. It could probably even be reduced to a single significant digit. In most cases, I'll probably round it off to tenths or hundredths of a unit, if in a research report. Miles, pounds, etc. may be included in parentheses if really necessary. I am also seeing a lot of reports are straying from the item number / object class / SCP / description format. Some are missing an object class, and while I'm at it, some have the wrong class in my opinion, and others are just cluttered white space wise. I am going to go ahead and make the sections number / class / SCP / description bold and add some white space where needed to make them easier to read. There's a couple that are pretty narrative, and I won't touch those without some discussion. I'd also like to edit the overdoing of many of the SCPs and descriptions. Reduce the usage of the words terminated. Reduce the usage of all caps where it isn't needed. Edit/removed, unexplained/excessive procedures, not ones that add to the experience. I mean ones like burying an object in 10 tons of dirt, and replacing the dirt every other day for no apparent reason. Or how every other SCP involves very precise temperature ranges which could never occur in nature prior to containment, etc. I don't mean to intrude on anyone's creativity here. Honest, I just see an opportunity for improvement is all.
With this message in mind, it was seen as the gradual end to the Edit This Wiki. However, it was for this reason specifically. Many projects that would start early are also known to be unpolished and not well written. SCP had this issue, and it had a weird format that shoved pop culture references in each article. Edit This wasn't entirely a permanent home for the SCP series in general. This is due to the fact the host of the website was forcing several of its own subscribers and own supporters to pay money, or else be removed from the internet entirely. And unfortunately, the SCP series did not have a way to pay themselves out of this, in which deletion of the site was inevitable to happen. That is, until the writer Fritz Willi moved all of the SCP series to a new website named Wikidot, which is the newly considered home for the SCP franchise. To this day, it serves as a platform that hosts and showcases all the stories of SCPs, as well as showcasing all of the series involved. They have their own feeds, main forums, discovery lists, and several format documents that are represented so that stories of all kinds could be found. This thankfully saved the series from it crashing and burning to the ground, and becoming a dead husk. Now, in 2008, lots of debates, politics, and conversations would take place within the community, and afterwards, it was settled that the SCP series is canon by the name of the SCP Foundation, and the logo was then changed into the most familiar one that we see to this day. This occurred on October 2009. 2 to 3 years would go by, as many features as well as entrees were being added to the SCP Wiki. It led to the Wiki categorizing these SCPs as the first 1,000 SCPs created by October 11th, 2011. The name of these SCPs would be given the title Series 1, which over the years has led up to 7 series being created by the time this video was posted anyways. It's quite impressive to see how far it has come, if I may add. Back on topic, when 2012 arrived, 2 major scenarios would occur that caused a huge event. January 19th, 2012 would begin the birth of the SCP video games, due to a video that was uploaded to YouTube by the name of SCP-087, with the channel owner name being Haversine, or Haversine, I don't frickin' know. The video seems to represent that of a video game, and it's 11 minutes long. At first glance, the game appears to be simplified, as it just shows a first-person view of a player walking down a never-ending set of stairs. The player would continue going down these steps, encountering ghostly apparitions, jump scares, as well as unsettling audio that can be heard. The intriguing part is that all floors are randomly generated, which means that every playthrough of the game is actually different. The story behind this is from the article of SCP-087, and for those of you that are interested, SCP-087 is an Object Class Euclid SCP that is an unlit platform staircase. The stairs descend on a 38-degree angle for 13 steps before reaching a semicircular platform of approximately 3 meters in diameter. Descent direction rotates 180 degrees at each platform. The design of SCP-087 limits subjects to a visual range of approximately 1.5 flights. A light source is required for any subjects exploring SCP-087, as there are no lighting fixtures or windows present. Lighting sources brighter than 75 watts have shown to be ineffective, as SCP-087 seems to absorb access light. Subjects report and audio recordings confirm the distressed vocalizations from what is presumed to be a child between the ages of and. The source of the distress calls is estimated to be located approximately 200 meters below below the initial platform. However, any attempts to descend the staircase have failed to bring subjects closer to the source. The depth of descent calculated from Exploration 4, the longest exploration, is shown to be far beyond both the possible structure of both the building and geological surroundings. At this time, it is unknown if SCP-087 has an endpoint. SCP-087 has undergone 4 video-recorded explorations by Class D personnel. Each subject conducting an exploration has encountered SCP-087-1, which appears as a face with no visible pupils, nostrils, or mouth. The nature of SCP-087-1 is entirely unclear, but it has been determined that it is not the source of the bleeding. Subjects exhibit feelings of intense paranoia and fear when faced with SCP-087-1. But it is undetermined whether said feelings are abnormal or simply natural reactions. SCP-087 is located on the campus of the doorway leading to SCP-087 is constructed of reinforced steel, with an electro-release lock mechanism. It has been disguised to resemble a janitorial closet consistent with the design of the building. The lock mechanism on the doorknob will not release unless vaults are applied in conjunction with counterclockwise rotation of the key. The inside of the door is lined with 6 centimeters of industrial foam padding. Due to the results of the final exploration, no personnel are permitted access to SCP-087. The ending of this video then shows the player meeting with the supposed SCP creature, and then the video cuts off as it stretches its hands out to grab the player. Very intriguing. Oh, right. And by the way, you probably noticed this by now, but within the SCP universe, the Foundation loves to keep a lot of secret data for security purposes. Therefore, you will notice a lot of these odd texts that I have been using in the video. There are 3 of them named Redacted, Data Expunged, and this is due to the intention of wanting to add unsettling writing, as well as a creep factor due to what else could potentially be hidden from the reader. Now back to the topics of the game. It inspired a game developer by the name of Jonas Rakonen, nicknamed Regalis, to create a game that is the same as SCP-087. However, it featured a never-ending corridor than never-ending stairs. This game could also be considered a stepping stone to the next games I will be listing soon as well. The name of this game is called SCP-087-B, which was released on January 30th, 2012. The game is an experimental horror game that was based on SCP-087, and from what is known, Regalis also made development on an extended version of the game, which drifted away from the canonical version of the SCP. It was developed over the course of 1 week, and it was posted to various image boards such as 4chan. The game is dark and met with an unsettling and hard to see atmosphere. It also appears that you can only see within a few feet in front of you, and your only viable option to progress is moving forward. However, some say that you have the constant fear of being watched, either from behind, in front, or all around in general while experiencing this game. There are also certain points of the game where you are met with various threats that are encountered at random intervals. The game begins at the entrance, where an unidentifiable doctor will tell the player through a radio to proceed down the hallway and to be cautious. For the rest of the game, the player is walking through hallways and down staircases while attempting to avoid monsters. There appears to be a total of 270 floors, and at random times, you will be chased by an unknown hostile creature, named the Masked Man. From what is known of this figure, is that the Masked Man is the most common entity that manifests throughout the game. It appears as a black humanoid figure wearing a white mask, with a smile, 2 circular black eyes, and all of its clothing also appears to be black too. And of course he has a menacing grin. This is designated as SCP-087-B-A. Throughout the game, it will manifest itself in a variety of ways. The masked man will manifest at either a corner of a turn or semi-halfway into a hallway for a split second before disappearing. This is typically the first creature the player will encounter during their descent. When the player is roughly halfway down a hallway, the hall will become darker, and the player will light a match to see what's in front of them. When lit, the match will reveal the masked man walking towards the player. Alternatively, the masked man may approach the player from behind under the same conditions, forcing the player to keep moving forward. There will also be the case in the game where there will be a brick wall in the way, which will move as the masked man nears it, allowing the player to keep moving and elude it. When the player begins to go down a new hallway, the hallway will become completely dark for a moment. The hallway will become brighter, and the masked man can be seen in the distance, looking at the player while standing at the end of the hallway. The darkness will then flicker a few times. During this, the masked man will get closer and closer to the player until it is standing right in front of them. This is theorized to be based off of SCP-173. Physical contact with the masked man will result in an instantaneous death. The player must keep their distance from it in order to stay alive. As the player progresses through the floors, they are then introduced to what's called the Red Mist Monster. This creature appears as a black humanoid figure with large red spots across its body and solid white eyes. It's also given a name by fans called SCP-087-B. It will appear a few times throughout the game, and before the 40th floor, the Red Mist Monster will manifest in the corner of the big room while shouting at the player not to look at it, as well as other quotes. The player must keep direct eye contact with it, otherwise it will quickly move towards the player and kill them. And you can tell this creature as well is speculated to be based on SCP-173. In the window hallway, the Red Mist Monster will spawn behind the window if the player looks into it, although it cannot harm the player. After approximately 20 floors, should the player encounter the fork path and walk directly up to the pit, the Red Mist Monster will appear behind the player and walk towards them. This entity will also shift the player instantaneously upon physical contact. There is also another entity that is called the Cheshire Smile. This face appears either as a disembodied twisted bloody smile with a pair of solid white eyes, or simply a pair of solid white eyes in the darkness. This face could also be considered as SCP-087-B. At random occasions throughout the game, it will manifest before the player with or without its smile. The exact distance from the player varies with each manifestation, ranging from being close to right in front of the player, to being nearly half of a hallway's length away from them. When the player moves close enough to it, it suddenly vanishes. While vanishing, it will whisper no to the player. This behavior occurs with each encounter of it, and it does not change in any way whatsoever. As for the last known NPC, or if you could even call them one, there is a character that is called the Unidentified Doctor, who seems to be a man that speaks via radio, albeit a horribly sounding one. He directs the experiment, counseling the player and directing them down the staircase. However, as time passes, you don't really get to communicate with the NPC that much. The signal also becomes weaker over time, to the point to where it'll be intercepted by a second voice who may possibly be one of the few monsters encountered in SCP-087-B.
087-B. Please proceed with caution. The radio signal seems to be getting weaker. Radio communication will become impossible. Next floor. Good luck.
Upon entering the last hallway, the walls behind the player will close in, and they will be ambushed as well as killed by the masked man, causing the game to intentionally crash. And upon crashing, various messages will appear. At this point in time, SCP-087-B was a huge success, and shortly after the game's release, Regalis began circulating it through various forums and YouTube videos, allowing the game to garner a significant amount of attention. It received a lot of praise for its claustrophobic atmosphere and randomized jump scares. The game's sudden rise in popularity made Regalis decide to further expand the game, adding more rooms and randomized events. The large amount of praise SCP-087-B had received inspired Regalis to try and create a larger horror game with more content to it, which would eventually become a very popular title called SCP Containment Breach. On April 15th, 2012, Scp Containment Breach was a game that was released in which marked the exploding popularity in the online horror genre department. The game, interesting enough, ran on the same engine as SCP-087-B, which is the Blitz 3D engine used to produce the game, albeit with more add-ons and a lot more content to showcase in comparison to his previous work. Scp Containment Breach is a free and open source horror game that sets itself in the universe of the SCP Foundation. The game is played from a first-person perspective, and the protagonist is a human test subject labeled D9341 in an SCP Foundation facility, which is devoted to containing and researching anomalous creatures, entities, and items labeled SCPs, just like on the wiki. The goal of the game is to escape from an underground SCP containment center in the situation of a complete security breach, which leads to the escape of the contained SCPs while avoiding security teams sent in to end the breach. The game also has a randomly generated play area and features multiple popular SCPs from the Foundation wiki. The gameplay revolves around you controlling a Class D personnel as he attempts to escape an underground research and containment facility operated by the SCP Foundation amidst a total containment breach of its hazardous SCPs. The player is also pursued by these numerous hostile SCPs, in which D9341 must avoid in order to not die, which is made more difficult by the player needing to blink periodically. And it immediately introduces itself as a very important mechanic against the most recognizable SCP-173. The same rules apply as they do in the origin story. You look at it, it stays still. You take your eyes off it for a split second, you die. Consider him your nemesis because you will be seeing this naughty peanut a lot in a playthrough. Certain environments, such as rooms filled with decontaminated gas, will cause the player to blink more often. And as you journey on, you'll find a lot more SCPs. For example, SCP-096, which will kill the player if its face is viewed, but otherwise he will remain docile. We will cover more of him shortly. One of the game's primary features is randomly generated rooms, like I mentioned. New SCPs and artifacts may appear in one map, but not in another. Some SCPs may even appear throughout the entire facility. However, the game becomes gradually more difficult as the player progresses, and the entrance zone marks the appearance of Mobile Task Force Epsilon 11 Nine-Tailed Fox. Naruto reference? ? They are a squad of elite soldiers deployed by the Foundation to recapture the breached SCPs, either by recontaining them or by destroying the facility altogether by detonating the nuclear bombs situated throughout the Foundation. These soldiers are armed with FNP-90 firearms and will shoot the player when detected. Along the way, the player can find a wide variety of items to assist them in survival. There are tools like gas masks, various electronic devices, batteries, and key cards of various levels for operating locked doors. They may also encounter benign or inanimate SCPs. So now that we kinda covered the gameplay, let us get into the actual plot of the game. As stated already, the game revolves around the SCP Foundation itself,
which we all know is a secretive organization dedicated to containing any anomalous blah 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 blah.
Anyways, at some point before the events of the game, Several of the Foundation's containment sites are attacked by the Chaos Insurgency, a rogue element of the Foundation, forcing the relocation of many SCPs, the designation given to their contained anomalies, to an unspecified site. The Task Force Nine-Tailed Fox is deployed shortly thereafter to defend the site from any more breaches and containment. Once again, the player takes the role of D-9341, and according to the lore and the game itself,
Class Ds are test subject personnel that are expendable personnel used to handle extremely hazardous anomalies and aren't allowed to come into contact with Class A or Class B personnel. Class D personnel are typically drawn worldwide from the ranks of prison inmates convicted of violent crimes, especially those on death row. In times of threats or violence, Protocol 12 may be enacted, which allows recruitment from other sources such as political prisoners, refugee populations, and other civilian sources that can be transferred into Foundation custody under plausibly deniable circumstances. Class D personnel are to be given regular mandatory psychiatric evaluations and are to be administered an amnestic of at least Class B strength or terminated at the end of the month at the discretion of on-site security and medical staff. In the event of a catastrophic site-related incident, Class D personnel are to be terminated immediately except as deemed necessary by on-site security personnel. Class D personnel are not permitted interaction with Class D personnel assigned to a different object or SCP. Class D personnel are recruited from prison inmates. Condemned persons are preferred. In times of duress, Protocol 12 can be authorized, allowing recruitment of innocent or persons incarcerated for lesser crimes. All Class D personnel are to be terminated at the first of the month, and new staff must be ready to replace them. After placement in quarters, staff must contact Class D personnel through the intercom system. All Class D personnel are to be given a minimum of one polygraph test at 1800 on a daily basis. Failure to comply will result in termination. Failure to pass the test will result in termination. In the event of any abnormalities, termination of entire Class D personnel is advised, as well as any SCP personnel that have had basic interaction with them.
Within the game, the Class D that you are playing as is forced with 2 other test subjects to perform tests on SCP-173. As to what tests they're doing, I don't fucking know. But the intriguing part that I like is the game offers you information pages about what these anomalies are capable of, as well as details, giving you a quick and brief summary on the dangers of what these SCPs you encounter will be. You are greeted by SCP-173, who's the concrete statue that can move at high speeds and attack by causing cervical fractures at the base of the skull, or strangulation when not in the direct line of sight of a person. During this testing routine, the site's power and door control systems begin to malfunction, allowing SCP-173 to kill the other 2 test subjects and escape into the ventilation system.
The door isn't responding to any of our attempts to close it, so please maintain direct eye contact with SCP-173 and...
While by player control, 9341 escapes the containment chamber. A very loud site-wide broadcast then announces that several SCPs have breached containment, forcing the site to be put under lockdown. The player must then guide 9341 around the facility while trying to survive many of the escaped SCPs which roam the facility, mostly the Keter and Euclid ones like SCP-096.
SCP-096 is a humanoid creature measuring approximately 2.38 meters in height. The subject shows very little muscle mass, with preliminary analysis of a body mass suggesting mild malnutrition. The arms are grossly out of proportion with the rest of the subject's body, with an approximate length of 1.5 meters each. Its skin is mostly devoid of pigmentation with no signs of any body hair. SCP-096's jaw can open to 4 times the norm of an average human. Its other facial features remain similar to an average human, with the exception of its eyes, which are also devoid of pigmentation. It is not yet known whether SCP-096 is blind or not. It shows no signs of any higher brain functions and is not considered to be sapient. SCP-096 is normally extremely docile, with pressure sensors inside its cell indicating that it spends most of the day pacing by the eastern wall. However, when somebody views SCP-096's face, whether it be directly via video recording or even a photograph, it will enter a stage of emotional distress. SCP-096 will cover its face with its hands and begin screaming, crying, and babbling incoherently. Approximately 1 to 2 minutes after the first viewing, SCP-096 will begin running to the person who viewed its face, who will from this point on be referred to as SCP-096-1. Documented speeds have varied from 35 km per hour to redacted km per hour and seem to depend on distance from SCP-096-1. At this point, no known method or material can impede SCP-096's progress. The actual position of SCP-096-1 does not seem to affect SCP-096's response. It seems to have an innate sense of SCP-096-1's location. Note that this reaction does not occur when viewing artistic depictions. Upon arriving at SCP-096-1's location, SCP-096 will proceed to kill and data expunged SCP-096-1. 100% of cases have left no traces of SCP-096-1. SCP-096 will then sit down for several minutes before regaining its composure and becoming docile once again. It will then attempt to make its way back to its natural habitat, data redacted due to the possibility of a mass chain reaction, including breach of Foundation secrecy and large civilian loss of life. Retrieval of the subject should be considered alpha priority.
With that being said, this creature is commonly found on cameras in-game, and can be heard crying. Most of the time it's best to avoid and walk past it, and it will leave you alone. However, as stated, if you catch even a small glimpse of its face, you die. And even if you get a running head start, it will hunt you down at impossibly fast speeds regardless. Since the game is randomly generated, progress at times can be quite difficult on your first playthrough. And in order to progress in the game, you need keycards to access doors around the facility that D-Class is normally not allowed to get into. You also can come across an SCP that can actually help you with ranking up said cards if you have a level 2 keycard. However, if you try to abuse its mechanic by trying to maximize it, it won't work as well as you would expect. The game was also graphically limited, so instead the creator took a clever approach on events that took place with the character. The game would occasionally describe what's happening to the player, whether they are in danger, being injured, or events occurring written in text. The audio, as well as the motion effects within the game, definitely help tie more into what's happening to the player, and in general is a very impressive way to enhance your immersion within this disturbing world. I mention this because I can almost guarantee on a first playthrough, you will die and see these pop up rather frequently. Continuing on, there is another SCP that will threaten you and pursue you like SCP-173 would, although it can be speculated judging from his lore that he is much more dangerous. SCP-106, Object Class, Keter. SCP-106 appears to be an elderly humanoid, with a general appearance of advanced decomposition. This appearance may vary, but the rotting quality is observed in all forms. SCP-106 is not exceptionally agile, and will remain motionless for days at a time, waiting for prey. SCP-106 is also capable of scaling any vertical surface and can remain suspended upside down indefinitely. When attacking, SCP-106 will attempt to incapacitate prey by damaging major organs, muscle groups, or tendons, then pull disabled prey into its pocket dimension. SCP-106 appears to prefer human prey items in the 10 to 25 years of age bracket. SCP-106 causes a corrosion effect in all solid matter it touches, engaging a physical breakdown in materials several seconds after contact. This is observed as rusting, rotting, and cracking of materials, and the creation of a black, mucus-like substance similar to the material coating to SCP-106. This effect is particularly detrimental to living tissues, and this is assumed to be a pre-digestion action. Corrosion continues for 6 hours after contact, after which the effect appears to burn out. SCP-106 is capable of passing through solid matter, leaving behind a large patch of its corrosive mucus. SCP-106 is able to vanish inside solid matter, entering what is assumed to be a form of pocket dimension. SCP-106 is then able to exit this dimension from any point connected to the initial entry point. Examples like entering the inner wall of a room and exiting the outer wall. entering a wall, and exiting from the ceiling. It is unknown if this is the point of origin for SCP-106, or a simple layer created by it. Limited observation of this pocket dimension has shown it to be comprised mostly of halls and rooms, with entry. This activity can continue for days, with some subjected individuals being released for the express purpose of hunting, recapture. The procedures state that no physical interaction with SCP-106 is allowed at any time. All physical interaction must be approved by no less than a 2/3 vote from O5 Command. Any such interaction must be undertaken in AR2 maximum security sites. After a general non-essential staff evacuation, all staff, research, security, Class D, etc. are to remain at least 60 meters away from the containment cell at all times, except in the event of breach events. SCP-106 is to be contained in a sealed container, comprised of lead-lined steel. The container will be sealed within 40 layers of identical material, each layer separated by no less than 36 centimeters of empty space. Support struts between layers are to be randomly placed. Containers to remain suspended no less than 60 centimeters from any surface by ELOD, IID electromagnetic supports. Secondary containment areas to be comprised of 16 spherical cells, each filled with various fluids and a random assembly of surfaces and supports. Secondary containment is to be fitted with light systems, capable of flooding the entire assembly with no less than 80,000 lumens of light instantly with no direct human involvement. Both containment areas are to remain under 24-hour surveillance. Any corrosion observed on any containment cell surfaces, staff members, or other site locations within 200 meters of SCP-106 are to be reported to site security immediately. Any items, objects, or personnel lost to SCP-106 are to be deemed missing, or KIA. No recovery attempts are to be made under any circumstances. According to his behavior, SCP-106 appears to go through long periods of dormancy, in which it will remain completely motionless for up to 3 months. The cause for this is unknown. However, it has been shown that this appears to be used as a luring tactic. SCP-106 will emerge from this in a very agitated state, and it will attack, abduct staff, and cause gross damage to its containment cell and the site at large. Recall Protocol. SCP appears to hunt and attack based on desire, not hunger. 106 will attack and collect multiple prey items during a hunting behavior event, keeping many alive in the pocket dimension for extended periods of time. SCP-106 has no determinable limit, and appears to collect a random number of prey items during an event. The inner dimension accessed by SCP-106 appears to be only accessible by him. Recording and transmission devices have been shown to still operate inside this dimension, though recordings and transmissions are very degraded. It appears that SCP-106 will play with captured prey, and appears to have full control of time, space, and perception inside this dimension. SCP-106 appears, and he is also mentioned in the Once But Not Now lore article as well. But in short, keep the creepy old corrosion man away from you, or you die, and he may or may not give you free candy van vibes. Moving on, as mentioned before, the player must additionally evade the nine-tailed fox soldiers deployed to recapture the SCPs, as they have been ordered to target and kill any stray Class D personnel. But on occasion, you will see that some have transformed into zombies. This is due to the case of SCP-049, whom we have covered earlier and is in the game. He appears with little to no introduction, and is immediately hostile to the player, reaching his hand out with his intention on curing the pestilence. As explained before, his touch is basically the equivalent to death upon contact. When he puts his hands on a human, he turns them into zombies, claiming he has cured them of their disease. And if he lays his hands on you, you die instantly and become one of his mindless zombie slaves, which then leads to a cutscene of the nine-tailed fox units taking you down. And if I'm correct, the hazmat suit is the only protection that you have against his touch. But if you give him enough time, he will remove the suit, and he will also kill you that way. The game gradually does become more intense, and you do encounter more SCPs as you progress, two of which are fairly similar, such as SCP-012, and another I will be covering shortly. The SCP itself is a Euclid class item that was retrieved by archaeologist K.M. Sandoval during the excavation of a northern Italian tomb destroyed in a recent storm. The object, a piece of handwritten musical score entitled On Mount Golgotha, Golgotha?
Me? Gungaga.
Anyways, it's part of a larger set of sheet music, and it appears to be incomplete. The red and black ink, first thought to be some form of berry or natural dye ink, was later found to be human blood from multiple subjects. The first personnel to locate the sheet, Site 19 Special Salvage, had 2 members descend into insanity, attempting to use their own blood to finish the composition, ultimately resulting in massive blood loss and internal trauma. Following initial investigations, multiple test subjects were allowed access to the score. In every case, the subjects mutilated themselves in order to use their own blood to finish the piece, resulting in subsequent symptoms of psychosis and massive trauma. Those subjects who managed to finish a section of the piece immediately committed suicide, declaring the piece to be impossible to complete. Attempts to perform the music have resulted in a disagreeable cacophony, with each instrumental part having no correlation or harmony with the other instruments. It is to be kept in a darkened room at all times. If the object is exposed to light, or seen by personnel using a light frequency other than infrared, remove personnel for mental health screening and immediate physical. The object is to be encased in an iron-shielded box, suspended from the ceiling with a minimum clearance of 2.5 meters from the floor, walls, and any openings. Encountering this item in-game will unfortunately lead the player towards the item, slowly becoming insane, and eventually self-harming themselves to try and finish the piece. It sadly does not end well, and it leads to a slow and painful death for the player. Interesting enough, this scene was one of, if not the only scene where the main character is actually speaking. However, it was due to being under the influence of the SCP. Now the next item, however, is encountered later on in the game. There happens to be a man wearing a suspicious-looking mask, but that in fact is actually a possessed host by the one and only SCP-035, Object Class Keter, who is also my favorite SCP fun fact, and the story behind 035 is a sadistic one to say the least. SCP-035 appears to be a white porcelain comedy mask, although it will at times change to tragedy. In these events, all existing visual records such as photographs, video footage, even illustrations of SCP-035 automatically change to reflect its new appearance. A highly corrosive and degenerative vicious liquid constantly seeps out from the eye and mouth holes of SCP-035. Anything coming into contact with this substance slowly decays over a period of time, depending on the material, until it has decayed completely into a pool of the original contaminant. Glass seems to react the slowest to the effects of the item, hence the construction choice of its immediate container. Living organisms that come into contact with the substance react much the same way, with no chance of recovery. The origin of the liquid is unknown. It is only visible from the front, and does not emerge or is even visible from the other side. Subjects within 1.5 to 2 meters of SCP-035, or in visual contact with it, experience a strong urge to put it on. When SCP-035 is placed on the face of an individual, an alternate brainwave pattern from SCP-035 overlaps that of the original host, effectively snuffing it out and causing brain death to the subject. The subject then claims to be the consciousness contained within SCP-035. The bodies of possessed subjects decay at a highly accelerated rate, eventually becoming a little more than mummified corpses. Nevertheless, SCP-035 has demonstrated the ability to remain in cognitive control of a body, experiencing severe structural damage. Even if the subject's body literally decays to the point where motion is not mechanically possible, no effect is found to be had when placed on the face of an animal. Conversations with SCP-035 have proven to be informative. Researchers have learned various details about other SCP objects and history in general, as SCP-035 SCP-035 claims to have been at many momentous events. SCP-035 displays a highly intelligent and charismatic personality, being both amiable and flattering to all those who speak with it. SCP-035 has scored in the 99th percentile of all intelligence and aptitude tests administered to it, and appears to have a photographic memory. However, psychological analysis has discovered SCP-035 to possess a highly manipulative nature, capable of forcing sudden and profound changes to interviewers' psychological state. SCP-035 has proven to be highly sadistic, prompting some to commit suicide and transforming others into near-mindless servants with linguistic persuasion alone. SCP-035 has stated that it has intimate knowledge of the workings of the human mind, and implied that it could change anyone's views if given enough time. 035 was found in a sealed crypt in an abandoned home in Venice in The special containment procedures show that SCP-035 is to be kept within a hermetically sealed glass case, no fewer than 10 centimeters thick. This case is to be contained within a steel, iron, and lead shielded room at all times, with the exception of allowing personnel in or out. No fewer than 2 armed guards are to be posted at any time. Guards must remain outside at all times and are not allowed within the containment room under any circumstances. A trained psychologist is to remain on site at all times. Research personnel are not to touch SCP-035 at any time. SCP-035 must be moved to a new sealed case every 2 weeks. The previous case must be disposed of via SCP-101, as it shows no adverse reactions to SCP-035's corruption. Anyone who comes into contact with SCP-035 when it's in possession of a host is to be given an immediate psychological evaluation. SCP-035 has been found to be able to possess anything that has a humanoid shape, including mannequins, corpses, and statues. SCP-035 has been able to motivate all into movement, removing the need to expose live subjects to SCP-035. Still, anything it possesses inevitably decays into motionlessness. It has been determined that SCP-035 is capable of telepathy, whether or not it possesses a host, even penetrating to the subconscious of others, and using the knowledge it finds to its advantage. Extreme caution is advised when choosing subjects to converse with SCP-035. In-game, it is shown that SCP-035 can be heard requesting for help over the radio, stating that it knows its way around the facility and that it can help the player escape. 035 can be found in its own containment chamber, attached to the face of one of the Foundation's scientists. When the player enters the control room adjacent to the chamber, 035 will stand up and begin to converse with the player. It will pace the room and ask to be released from confinement, stating that if the player opens the door, they can assist them in escaping the facility.
Oh, thank God. Someone actually found me. I thought I was done for a moment there. I can get us both safely to the surface. Just find the control panel in there and open the chamber doors for me.
It will also attempt to prove that it's trustworthy by giving the player the passcode to the storage room, containing a few helpful items.
Alright, look. If you still don't think I'm trustworthy enough, there's a locked storage room behind you. You probably noticed that it's guarded with a 4-digit passcode. Inside is some useful equipment, as well as a pill of SCP-500. The passcode is 5731. Got it? 5731. You see? You can trust me. Now please, just hurry and open the door.
If the player activates the gas valves, 035 will begin coughing and gagging while begging you to turn them off. Leaving the gas valves on for a long period of time will cause 035's host to die. After a few seconds, 035 will reanimate itself and criticize the player for their actions, stating that a Class D like them would not live to make it out.
some help and you try to thank me by suffocating me?
So, you really don't want to leave this place alive, do you? You know there's no way a lone D-class like you will make it to the surface safely. Even if you did, they'd gun you down the moment you came across their reticles. I'll give you one more chance here. Just open the chamber doors, and we'll forget about this little gas incident.
If the player opens the chamber door, 035 will tell them one of the three things depending on the player's actions. If they release 035 immediately, it will mention that SCP-079 is in control of the facility. If they release it after activating the gas valves but deactivate it before angering 035, it will mention that Gate A is the player's best chance of escape. If they attempt to kill 035 with the gas, it'll state that SCP-012 is actually a map, which is obviously a false claim. Once 035 leaves its chamber, the player is able to enter the room. However, hostile tentacles will rise up from the ground inside the chamber and attack the player if they are close enough. But if you're wearing the heavy hazmat suit, you're not going to be harmed. 035's host can later be found dead in another location of the facility, and if you approach the corpse, a tentacle will rise out of it. You can tell that the creator put a lot of love and work into this title, on top of fitting in a lot of SCPs that are more well known, and some are even just items or entities. There are just so many within this game that it just makes it all the more enjoyable, or creepy once you finally do discover all of them, some of which even have altercations in how the ending goes for you in the story. From what can be understood, the game is said to have 4 endings, and just as a small warning, I will be getting into spoiler territory for the ending of the game. The first ending is called Gate A, Good Ending 1. If the player has not or failed to recontain SCP-106, upon reaching Gate A, MTF will be too busy making sure 106 does not cross the bridge, using the HID turret. The player can use this by quickly running down the road and entering the tunnel. Upon reaching the end, the player will be met by 4 Chaos Insurgents saying,
"You know too much to let them get you. You're coming with us."
Next up, we have Gate A Good Ending 2. This ending requires the player to have successfully recontained SCP-106. Upon reaching Gate A, the player will be greeted by 3 Nine-Tailed Fox units. They will order the player to halt, but surprisingly they do not kill you. At the end, a tape will be played by a scientist mentioning 9341's ability to contain and respawn.
Subject demonstrates extraordinary luck and complete mastery of even the most fatal of circumstances and an uncanny ability to predict even the most unpredictable of hazards, almost as if it has performed these impossible tasks several times before. Further testing is required to determine whether the subject should receive a SCP classification.
The third ending is Gate B, Bad Ending 1. In this ending, the player does not disable the warheads and moves to Gate B. The guard positioned on the perimeter wall will start firing, but he will miss all the shots due to long distance. Once the player has passed the iron tunnel, a voice on the intercom will announce that the warheads will be detonating in 90 seconds. Once detonated, an ending audio can be heard. 2 helicopters are communicating, and 1 will crash down due to SCP-682.
Now, I repeat, SCP-682 is out of the facility. All available helicopters and MTF units to Gate B now. We're detonating the Alpha warheads in T-minus 90 seconds. All All personnel are advised to board the nearest helicopter or enter the nearest blast shelter immediately.
This is CH1 to OH6. Have you located the target? Over. OH6 to CH1. No sign of the target. I think we should send it MTF. CH1 to OH6. Do you copy?
And then the last one is called Gate B, Bad Ending 2. To achieve this ending, the player must disable the warheads at the Alpha Warhead Silo, located in the Heavy Containment Zone. Once outside, the guard will start shooting the player like in Bad Ending 1, but misses as well. Again, the intercom will announce that the warheads are detonating in 90 seconds. This time though, after 90 seconds, they will announce the following. In a few seconds, MTF will appear, killing the player. The ending audio will play a conversation between a commander and NTF Audi.
We were unable to detonate the warheads for unknown reasons. All helicopters and NTF units go back to Gate B immediately. Capturing SCP-682 is now our #1 priority.
Sir, we found a dead Class D on the walkway outside Gate B. He's got multiple gunshot wounds in his chest. I'd assume he was shot when we were fighting SCP-682. I'd like to know how the hell did a Class D get past the gate? Deliver me the security tapes from all the cameras near the gate and find out who was stationed there before and during 682's escape attempt. Roger that, sir.
In general, this game has received a lot of positive reception from players, considering the game to be terrifying but also highly replayable by speedrunners, as well as those who adore the universe of the franchise. Several YouTubers have taken a huge liking to this game as it helped popularize SCP to even greater heights, and made a lot of wandering eyes more curious to the lore of the SCP Foundation. The game itself is a perfect way to introduce yourself into the world of SCP, if you are new to its content, and it may even encourage you to read some of the entrees the website has to offer. Given that it started at Series 1 a long time ago, it has now managed to reach up to Series 7, and there's lots of new entrees ready to be written and read by brilliant and creative minds. At least some, anyways. To basically summarize 2 to 7 so far, I would say that they probably got the biggest catalog of stories you could ever read for a creepypasta universe. And there's actually thousands of stories, whether it's SCP-1000, who's basically Bigfoot, the proclaimed omnivorous ape, SCP-1230, which is a book SCP that turns your dreams into a fantasy world that makes you into a hero, which I personally think is a great concept. Or even SCP-5163, called the cutest teddy bear of all times, that makes you happy when you hold it. Similar effects to that of SCP-999, who's a cute little slime boy that makes anyone happy upon contact. However, his mind is filled with constant laughs and he gives people those emotions, but he can actually make someone laugh to death if given the opportunity. Still gotta love him though. But seriously, I mean, look at this! It's fucking nuts. You could literally get stuck on this website for weeks trying to catch up with all these stories. And boy, you could tell that SCP as a whole came from such a long and huge road. From being the small creepypasta post thread on 4chan to the colossal beast that it is now. And to be honest, I truly believe that the game itself is what sparked this whole community to go to where it is now in terms of popularity. And as far as I know, the game also has a multiplayer version too, where you can actually play with your friends on Steam. And as far as I know, this game has been released recently before the time this video was even being posted. You basically go through the same thing as what you did in your solo playthrough, although if I'm correct, they added even more content and you are doing it all with your friend, or best friend, or lover, or butt buddy. Maybe. I believe the name of the game is called SCP Secret Lab, but you can also call it SCP Multiplayer. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a mode where you basically go toe-to-toe with each other in matches. The game functions just like Containment Breach, albeit with obvious changes. You can even play as one of the 7 SCPs the game has to offer. There is also a map creator, an active dev team, and random generation just like what the vanilla game had. From what is also known is that this game was originally based from the Garry's Mod game mode called Breach. There are also 3 factions that are in the facility with different goals. The Class Ds are to try and escape from the Foundation and avoid all attackers. The SCPs are supposed to go chaotic and kill whatever is on sight for them using their abilities. And then the 9-tailed fox units are to try and rescue scientists, as well as neutralize Class Ds, or as a last resort, fight the SCPs. Before they most of the time one-shot everything in their paths, they are also the hardest to kill. The games themselves are more hilarious, fun, and can actually be creepy at times when confronted with the SCPs, especially when put into intense situations like trying to hide from them or trying your hardest to gun them down. And in a way it could almost feel similar to the intensity that some games of Dead by Daylight bring to the table, and I'm pretty sure some of you out there that play that game already know exactly what I'm talking about. Regardless, SCP Secret Lab is a lot of fun, and what's even better is that the game is free. At least from what I know anyways. I recommend trying it out sometime, because I see it as a fun experience that you can goof off with mates. Now for my understanding, the SCP Containment Breach game has released its final patch notes on August 19th, 2018. They added a lot over the years of these patches, but it does sadden me to see that they have discontinued it. My guess is from the outdated engine that was used to run the game. However, there are some talented creators out there that seek to remake the game, but with a better and cleaner engine. A long while ago, there was even development of a game called SCP Unity Remake. This game at the time was being developed by a team named Airy Gaming Studios and was led by Zornor90. The game was inspired by the SCP Containment Breach game, as well as other horror games and experiences. The game at one point was a simple port and graphics upgrade, but the project has since been expanded to encompass a wider array of content. They basically wanted to include more graphical improvements, more and new SCPs, and a deeper story. The game was being playtested and showcased by creators in between 2018 to 2021, and at the time it was considered a beautiful and faithful remake to that of the original game. They also included the older SCPs from the original game, but they did change a few of them in terms of design, which to each their own, I guess. But regardless, people genuinely liked it, and I could say the same myself. But unfortunately, there's some bad news. A while ago, there was a post that was made by the developer, stating that the development for the game was cancelled. However, I can reason with his decision and why he made it.
Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I never wanted to make this announcement, but unfortunately, SCP Unity development has been cancelled. About 6 to 8 months ago, I noticed my health was taking a massive nosedive. This continued until a month ago, where it got so bad that I was having some serious test runs at the hospital. They didn't find anything seriously wrong at the moment, but all of these serious symptoms were caused by massive stress and overwork, which would lead to very serious things down the line. Because of this, as well as some other personal life changes, I made the decision to shut this down. I know that this is probably really disappointing for you guys, and it's not the decision that I wanted to have to make, but I firmly believe that sacrificing your health is never the right move.
With this post being in mind, it's totally understandable why they made this move. Having a lot of pressure and health issues takes its toll on a human being. Hopefully there will be another creator out there that has taken notes and witnessed the talent this creator has shown in demos, so that another project could be in the works. On the bright side, however, the SCP Multiplayer game is receiving a lot of updates, and has a huge active following, so we are bound to see new content in store for those that are curious. The same could be said for the rapidly growing SCP Wiki, and the community there is constantly thriving and has been around for several years. Now, back onto the topic of creepypastas once more. There happens to be some out there that either age decently, aged like rotten spoiled milk, or aged like fine wine. And you know, I could say that for SCP, seeing that it's hidden in the deepest, dirtiest, and smelliest trenches of the internet, into the masterpiece universal franchise it has evolved into. SCP is what you get when you have a handful of creative writers that seek to put out content that intrigues a lot of individuals, captivates readers, and has a fanbase that loves what they make. Not to mention the creator of the SCP games that has further helped the community gather and become what it is as of now. Quite beautiful seeing such a thing, wouldn't you agree? And who's to think that it was all thanks to the start of this one tall, oddly colored statue. In conclusion, SCP is a topic that someone like me can go on for hours and hours about the lore it hides, as well as what stories lie beneath them. Some are even awaiting as to what new stories are going to be brought into the light for readers to enjoy. And to be honest, I could not recommend the wiki more. It's personally a great time killer if you're at work or something, but you want to read about how an evil teddy bear was once cute and innocent, but made people suffocate by growing ears on them, or even more ridiculous stories like that. SCP has been a part of my life for years, shall I say, and seeing it get to where it is now is truly a sight to behold, given I also seen how far it's come and the amount of work several people have put into this franchise as a whole. Regardless, I am grateful to see how much the community has grown, as well as the series in general. Maybe I should write my own SCP and submit it to the wiki one day. But I am afraid I lack the time for it, and I am more busy getting content like this out for you folks to enjoy. Anyways, until more is shown, and we are given more news and updates as to what's in store for us, that is the story, and shall I say rabbit hole, of the SCP Foundation. Why hello there, my dear viewers. I would just like to say thank you for coming by to this video and sticking around the channel for so long. This project has been on my mind for the longest time, but thankfully I had the time to get it out despite the massive amount of work that I put in for this video. Now you might be thinking I could be burning myself out, or that I am becoming a bit extreme with these lengthy videos, and the answer to that I would say is half correct. I am not burned out, my dears. I am just simply motivated, something that one such as myself is highly grateful to feel. Now, despite you and I not speaking much with one another on a personal level, given my monthly gaps in uploads, your positive comments, your wonderful support, as well as your assistance in this channel hitting milestones, like 2,000 subscribers, that is just maddening to me. But with all that being taken into consideration, it is simply a motivator for me to continue doing these types of videos. Some of you out there may even be wondering what my goals are, and well, my goals are simple. I wish for nothing more than to entertain, educate, and create lots of attention for those of you that are watching. Kinda like any other YouTuber, am I right? Anyways, I won't talk your ears off for much longer, but I did just want to let you all know that I appreciate the things you are doing, and that maybe we could gradually create something good for ourselves. Wouldn't you say so? I say let us go crazy, because sometimes that's something a lot of us want to do. Now then, with that being said, thank you all for stopping by. Don't forget to leave a subscribe with the bell turned on, and don't forget to leave a like. Have yourselves a good morning, a good afternoon, and I hope you all have yourselves a good night.
I can see them.